Hi, everyone. Hope everyone's doing well, and I hope everyone's adjusting to our online asynchronous format as the semester goes on. I want to remind you that as you watch these module lectures, keep in mind that these are lectures in which I highlight important concepts from the chapters. Although these are highlights of important concepts, it is still very important for you to keep up with your reading on your own when you look at the chapters in the text. Watching and listening to the module lectures, in addition to doing your own reading and keeping up with the reading, is what will help you succeed as you work on your homework assignments, your lecture quizzes, and obviously leading up to the final cumulative exam. So, in other words, I'll never be able to, especially as we get into some of the longer chapters, be able to cover absolutely every single detail from the chapter in these presentations, but I do provide points of emphasis and hopefully some alternative interpretations of what you are reading that hopefully will help you better understand the content. So again, don't just rely on just the module lectures. Keep in mind that you should not be ignoring your reading. Okay, let's get into our fifth module lecture. In this module lecture, we will cover chapter 6 and 7. These chapters cover the concepts of competition and cooperation, feedback, reinforcement, and intrinsic motivation. Of course, we're going to define these terms, and on top of that, we're going to look into how these concepts, these terms work together or intertwine with one another to affect sports performance. Let's start out by digesting competition and cooperation. Looking at these two definitions, that is competition as a social process that occurs when rewards are given to people for how their performance compares with the performances of others during the same task or when participating in the same event, and cooperation, a social process through which performance is evaluated and rewarded in terms of the collective achievement of a group of people working together to reach a particular goal. We can see that both of these concepts are somewhat related, but not the same. And at the same time, not complete opposites as well. And as we get through today's presentation, we're going to see ways in which we can balance competition and cooperation, or obviously we can encourage our athletes that we work with, that we engage with on a daily basis to balance these two concepts to better perform. So let's dive in a little bit deeper into competition. With competition, we also have the idea of decompetition, where we see competition as a more healthy alternative to decompetition. We look at competition as, in addition to the definition we just looked at, a partnership between you as an individual or your team as an individual team versus another individual or another individual team. We know that those that engage in true competition, they essentially seek opportunities to compete in fair environments. They use their competition to make each other better. I think that's the should be the premise of healthy competition. Decompetition, clearly not as healthy. Here is where more of a rivalry takes place. And although winning is the ultimate goal, you can see how decompetition, although it is valuable in some cases, over time can end up being more of an obsessive concept, and over time can be something that could be potentially detrimental to the performance of the athlete, particularly if values of competition are not withheld over a period of time. So let's talk about the competitive process. How does competition take place? How do athletes internalize competition? Well, we really have four stages as part of the competition process. We have stage one, in which an objective competition situation is a situation that allows the performer, which is the athlete, to compare themselves to one another. So there has to be some level of events, some task in which there can be competition that takes place. Right? There has to be something, whether it's a sport, whether it's a drill at practice, whether it's a particular task, something has to be created objectively that can measure one better performance versus another performance that maybe is not as good. There needs to be a way to put people on a pedestal to know what's better and what's worse. Moving into stage two, then the athlete starts to think subjectively of what happens as a result of beating the other individual. Is there better praise? Is there more perception of higher capability, higher ability? What was the weight associated with the objective outcomes And of course, assuming that weight, that's a subjective feature. There's a feeling associated with the level of competition where the athlete again starts to think about things such as how well I feel if I beat this individual. How will my team feel? How do we feel as a team? How will the other person feel? How will the other team feel? These are all questions that start coming to fruition when the athlete gets to stage two. Now, an important note that I really like here that I think is important to point out, competitiveness is the personality characteristic that best predicts how people appraise the objective competitive situation. What does that mean? That means that how competitive someone is inherently as part of the personality, and we've spent plenty of time talking about personality earlier on in the semester, that's going to determine how much weight they put on a objective situation. I've heard stories from reading, from different videos of Michael Jordan, who, I hope all of you know who that is. He, as an ultra competitor, regardless of what he was doing, even off the basketball court, he was always extremely competitive, whether it was playing poker, it could be, I don't know, other stories such as, shooting things into a trash can, you name it. Everything became a small, or even if it was a small objective competitive situation, Michael Jordan, with the people around him, he perceived it as, regardless of the task, big or small, whether it's related to basketball or not, he wanted to be the top dog. He wanted to be the person that ultimately showed you that he was the guy in charge, that he was the one that was always winning. So his subjective competitiveness always attributed a high level of stakes to any task, whether small, big, basketball related or not. So in that case, for him, his inherent competitiveness always had him on, regardless of what the task was, regardless of what the goal was, always had him on. So once that subjectiveness gets attributed to the objective situation, the athlete then moves into the remaining stages. There's a response stage where the individual completes the competitive task and then potentially approaches or avoids the situation again, obviously depending on the response. Now, this is something that's related to if someone perhaps is a sore loser or a boastful winner, that how they react is going to affect how they go back into the next situation, if it's the same objective task, through a competitive lens. So essentially, it dictates how they are going to respond when provided within the same competitive situation or another situation. And in stage four, similar to stage three, what are the consequences? Because the person is a sore loser as part of the response, do they no longer seek to remain in those competitive situations? Do they continue to avoid those competitive situations? Or maybe they're eager. Maybe their response is, when they win, they want to prove that they can win again. So their consequence is to seek out the same competitive situation or continue to seek out competitive situations. So you can see how stages 3 and 4 are very closely tied. So again, just to recap those four, and I'll go back here just a second. Competitive process. How does an athlete perceive competition? Well, stage one, something has to happen. There has to be a task at hand that results in competition, that creates competition. Stage two, the athlete determines subjectively how important that task is to them, and they determine whether or not it's something that they value very high or very low. And then stages 3 and 4, there's a response to the result of that competitive situation, whether they win, lose, and how they respond obviously affects the consequences. And then 3 and 4 play a huge role in how the athlete will respond to the next similar competitive situation or different competitive situation. Looking at this figure from your text, I really like this figure because what it does, it shows you that it's an ongoing process. It's not clear cut in terms of stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, stage 4. It's over. It is an ongoing process that feeds itself. And like I said, looking at the bottom circle and the left circle, obviously those represent stages 3 and 4. Those determine the attitudes, because if you look there in the top left of that circle, the attitudes going into the next objective competitive situation. When you hear things such as someone loses a game or a match and they have something to prove, that ends up being an attitude, which of course affects the next objective competitive situation. When you hear things such as, maybe somebody always wins and they get complacent, and they end up being maybe a not so humble winner. They're always bragging about their winnings and they're very cocky. That affects the attitude going into the next objective competitive situation. And these objective competitive situations don't have to be taken at a game level, at a match level. They can be within a game, within a match. Think about different sports. There can be different plays in which you win, different plays in which you lose. There can be different points in which you win, points in which you lose, baskets in which you win, baskets in which you lose. So again, if you look at this perspective, the competition process on that play to play, period by period, quarter to quarter basis, you can see how as people fluctuate throughout the course of a competitive event, different situations can be approached with different attitudes. So hopefully that really does tie things in uh, well for you. And what the example I gave earlier with Michael Jordan, if we look at the top right of the circle, personality dispositions, people that are inherently more competitive as part of the personality, they're going to put more weight into that competitive situation. So hopefully um, that helps clarify things. And then just to kind of wrap this up, on the bottom right, obviously, after the person puts a amount of weight on the task that they have to get done, whether they're skilled, whether they're not skilled, maybe they're more skilled, more talented than their individual, so their ability is higher, so they're able to respond with a win, or maybe they're not as skilled, not playing as well, so maybe they respond with a loss. And then, of course, you see there the response, and of course, ties into the consequence. So the second part of this is cooperation. Now, something that's really important to point out about cooperation, which we saw on the first slide, is essentially people working together in the same given task, which is somewhat opposite to competition. And I say somewhat opposite because it's important to note that competition and cooperation are not direct opposites. There's a relationship between the two, and I think particularly when we start thinking about team sports, that makes a lot of sense. In any given team sport, there's always a level of competition and there's always a level of cooperation, particularly if you have to find yourself cooperating with your teammates to go against another team, which is a level of competition. Both of you have the same task to win, and the other team is of course cooperating with themselves. So that's a good way to think about how these two elements are always at play during performance. A couple things that are really interesting when we start looking at the um, relationship between competition working against each other and cooperation working together are some findings that come up in research. So these two findings in particular related to cyclists and those performing puzzles are really interesting. We look at the first finding that essentially tells us that cyclists were faster in competition than alone racing against the clock. So what that tells us is competition in this context had a increase in performance because the cyclists saw their competitors running alongside them and they wanted to beat them, perhaps in a fair environment. They wanted to improve their own performance again to be seen as that alpha dog, to be seen as that top dog, to be seen as that individual that was the ultimate winner. So again, they had more of a push than they were against the clock, something that they couldn't necessarily visualize as well as the actual competitors that are with them. When we look at the finding related to puzzles, we saw that competition group students were self-centered, directed efforts at beating others, and had close communication, conflict, distrust, versus cooperation group students communicated openly, shared information, developed friendships, and solved more puzzles. So what does that mean? Go back to what I said earlier, where you think about team sports and how some of the best successful teams are those that can embrace the cooperation within the team and, of course, the competition against the other team. When you look at the findings related to those competing in puzzle making, puzzle solving, the students that go in based on this research determined just to win at all costs, they're not willing to listen. They close others out. They engage in more conflict versus those that go into the situation, again, the competitive situation, with a more cooperative approach. They share information. They're open. They're okay to fail at certain points because they know they have the support from their teammates, in this case, their group mates. They develop friendships. They solve more puzzles. So they end up being more effective. So when you hear things such as um, a team in which you have individuals that tries to do things all on their own, or you have a set of individuals who try to work within themselves and not within the team, that could be a detriment to failure, particularly if the other team is just as skilled or more skilled and talented, and they're working better as a team. That's why, and again, I always tie this to basketball because if you haven't picked up by now, basketball is my favorite sport. In basketball, you have situations where a team in which a player may score 40, 50, 60 points may still lose because they may not be working within the team and just working within themselves. And that's a very common thing you see in basketball and something you see in football and plenty of other sports as well. You have an individual with a stellar performance, but if they don't play within the team, there's not that level of cooperation, or even worse, maybe you see that they perform well, but maintain poor communication, and there's still some conflict along the way of the performance. It's no surprise that they can still lose to their competition that is cooperating within itself, even if they don't have individual performances. And of course, you can imagine that there's a balance, and these aren't necessarily definite, but that is generally what the research shows as it pertains to performance and as it pertains to competition and cooperation. So as I hopefully mentioned earlier, hopefully I didn't forget to mention this, when you look at competition and decompetition, competition is not good or bad, it's neutral. You know, how competitive someone is obviously can be helpful at times, can be detrimental at times if it's, if it takes over and starts to diminish cooperation. That's why, particularly in the team dynamic and different social environments, it's important to have people of different caliber, right? People that can keep each other in check. Some people that maybe by nature are more competitive, more cooperative. Maybe someone, particularly the team leaders, hopefully they know how to go up and down the continuum when it relates to being more competitive, being more cooperative. Because, of course, if someone is ultra competitive, that becomes rather aggressive as opposed to more cooperative. And what you really see is if there is not a well maintained balance of aggression or cooperation, then you start to see detriments to performance. So, again, competition, not necessarily something that's good or bad, it's neutral. And the level of competition is contingent on not only the personality traits that the person has, that this athlete has, but also the social environment, which, as you see here, again, dictate whether that competition leads to aggression or cooperation. Generally, as I mentioned with the puzzle example, cooperation leads to better performance when compared to competition, although that does vary depending on the task. Competition can serve as a positive source of motivation to improve and refine skills. So, in sport, some level of comparison with your counterparts is not always a bad thing. Obviously, when it becomes obsessive and starts being a detriment to your performance, that's when you start to suffer. But when you realize things that you are not doing that your counterparts are, and they're being more successful in how they're doing it, you can learn from that and you can seek to say, hey, what is this person doing that I'm not? Or this person does this better. What's their technique? What are their fundamentals? Those are things you can ask yourself as an athlete to seek self improvement. And that's a good thing. It's not a bad thing. Sport, of course, ultimately leads to cooperative teamwork and behavior. And this is even seen, I think, when you hear teamwork, I'm sure most of you just think of the team sports, but even in the individual sports, there's always, most of the times, there's always a team. I'll give you an example. So think about golf, right? Most people identify golf as an individual sport, but even in golf, the golfer himself or herself has to work with their caddy. The person that carries the clubs on the out in the field. But when working with the caddy, it's not uncommon to have, especially when the golfer and the caddy have been working for a long time together, it's not uncommon to have the golfer ask the caddy for their opinion on which club they should use or on which way the wind is going, or where they should try to hit it. It's not uncommon, right? That's a little bit of a team atmosphere there. Think about NASCAR. Very easy to think about that as an individual sport. You have one driver, one car going around and around and around. Well, every time they get to a pit stop, there's a team, a large team, right? Working on the car, making sure the driver's okay, checking in with the pacing of the driver, even during the race itself. There's always communication on the intercom. Again, more of that team atmosphere. So even though sport may not be necessarily a team sport by the technical sense, there can still definitely be high levels of cooperation spread amongst, and that's how you have sport that encourages that cooperative teamwork. One more example, I won't go on and on, but think about MMA. You get in the octagon, one athlete against another athlete, one fighter against another fighter. But again, how did that athlete get there? Months, years of practice with their coach, with other sparring partners, with physicians, nutritionists, whoever, all part of that team to get that athlete, that fighter to that particular moment. So again, whether it's team or individual sports, there's always some way for there to be a connection to that competitive spirit. So ultimately, how do we balance these two? How do we for ourselves as athletes or for athletes that we continue to work with in the future, how do we encourage the balance between the two? Because we know both are important, and we realize that when competition takes over and starts detrimenting or starts diminishing, I should say, cooperation, that's when we start getting in trouble. We do these kind of things. We can blend competition and cooperation with teaching and coaching physical skills. So, we teach skills, we balance drills, um, individual drills, and team drills. We kind of intermix them within one another throughout practice. We look at, particularly if we're looking at a team and we have individual positions or perhaps players of different skills, every now and then we can break up the practice, we can break up the training to better represent their individual needs. We can structure games, and it says for children, but obviously, depending on who you're working with, you can do this with anybody really, to include both competition and cooperative elements. How do you do that? Well, you see this a lot where you have um, practices where this team itself scrimmages against one another. Obviously within practice itself, there's competition, but there's also um, cooperation. I'll tell you another example of something I've seen recently. So covering a East Stroudsburg University, the other university where I teach and I work as an athletic trainer, one of their practices, they would run shooting drills in pods of 3, where obviously the team that, or the pod, I should say, that had the most goals after a set period of time, that pod would win. So, it became very important for each pod to cooperate within itself, but also to have a level of competition when compared to the others. Now, look at the bottom. Look at the bottom guideline. When competition leads to fierce rivalry, then we can have a little bit of a problem, particularly if it's not controlled. But what we can do is we can look at larger goals, right? You think about situations where you maybe have teams or individual athletes competing against one another at their own practice. Sometimes you hear stories of that getting out of hand. People get into heated arguments, or worst case scenario, maybe there's some sort of physical altercation, or some level of tension. Maybe it doesn't have to get that far, but some level of tension is obviously present. How do you get people back on the same page? You remind them that they're part of a team, remind them of their larger goal. So looking at the bigger picture, particularly when competition leads to fierce rivalry within a team, is important. And then lastly, some remaining guidelines here. Positive feedback, encouragement is important. Um, Understanding or having your athletes understand that if cooperation is not present at all, particularly in the team environment, you start to lose out on trust. You start to lose out on open communication. Of course, those are things that are needed to succeed. There has to be opportunities for the learning of sports skills and the practice of these skills in competition. I think we kind of get how that makes sense as well. Okay, so now we're going to switch gears. We're going to get into feedback, reinforcement, and particularly looking at intrinsic motivation. So feedback, of course, there's different levels of feedback, and we're going to talk about those as well. But I want to start with the concept of reinforcement. Reinforcement is the use of rewards and punishment, which increase or decrease the likelihood of a similar response occurring in the future. So what you start to see is typically when someone is rewarded for a behavior, they're more likely to do that behavior versus when someone is punished, obviously they're less likely to do that behavior. Now, in sport, and some of you who are athletes or have been athletes, I'm sure you've had many coaches that have towed the line between reward and punishment as means of reinforcement. There is some room of punishment in sport. And when I say punishment, don't think of it as something that is illegal or necessarily painful all the time. But that being said, when punishment is overdone, it starts having a negative effect on morale and starts affecting performance. And we're going to see exactly how that makes sense. So before we get there, let me just show you the short clip by Dr. Gordon Bloom, and it's very short, less than a minute here. He will quickly discuss the importance of appraising, of providing some level of praise to members of a team, regardless of their star status, I could say, or their best player status on that team. So just give me a second here. I'm going to pull up this video for us to watch.
Praise every athlete. So there's maybe some athlete that has a very diminished role on the team. But if you can point out that athlete's contributions, you're going to make him or her feel just as special as the person in ice hockey who's scoring all the goals or making all the saves. So for me, it's highlighting every player on the team and making sure that you let everybody know, especially them, that you value their contributions, however large or small they may be in the greater picture. You can motivate and inspire without yelling or criticizing. And I've really learned over the years that if you're going to lose your cool or lose your temper, make sure it's planned and you're doing it for a reason rather than just something you can't control.
That's an excellent point at the end. And that kind of goes into punishment. And like I just said, yes, there's a little bit of room for punishment in sport, and particularly coaches working with athletes. But when that line gets crossed in terms of punishment being constant all the time, occurring for no reason, unfair, then you start to see those coaches that really struggle to help not only their athletes succeed, but start detrimenting their performance of their athletes. And of course, there's different coaching styles. We won't get too much into that now. But again, we're going to get into just how punishment as a means of reinforcement may not necessarily be as effective as certain levels of reward as an incentive when it comes to reinforcement. So let's talk about positive reinforcement. Remember, when we talk about positive reinforcement, this is reinforcement in which you do something, and again, this can be in the form of a reward or a punishment, something good, something bad. Positive reinforcement, you do this because you want to continue the behavior that's taking place. So let's see how this plays out. So in order for positive reinforcement to work, you want there to be effective reinforcers, whether it's something that's social, material, activity, special outings, intrinsic, extrinsic. Think about social, maybe some level of praise from your teammates. Material, maybe if you do a certain thing, you can get. I'm trying to just think of a good example here. You can get headbands or start putting, or the coach decides to put in money towards getting new cleats, activity. Maybe instead of going to, if you do this certain thing, if you win this certain game, maybe you can miss one day of practice. You can think of all the examples, but again, these are effective reinforcements that are effective for that group. The timing of the reinforcement has to be chosen. There has to be early learning, continuous and immediate reinforcement if desirable, is desirable. Learn skill, intermittent, and immediate reinforcement desirable. So what does that mean? That means that if someone is learning a skill for the first time, ideally that reinforcement should be continual, should happen as the person's learning. But if the skill's already learned and they're just trying to maintain the skill or maintain their ability throughout practices, then that reinforcement can be, relatively spread out throughout the process. A couple other things that are important to note: reward appropriate behaviors, shape the behavior of the learner by reinforcing close approximations of the desired behavior. So, again, when skills are difficult, as you see there, the one part I left out, if someone is close for getting better, but maybe not exact to the exact nature of the skill, that should still warrant positive reinforcement, especially as the person's improving. Reward performance as well as outcome. Someone can play really well and still lose. That's where that goes into it. So a coach can tell a team, hey, we lost, but we did good things here, 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 or this particular player really shined here, and so on and so forth. There can be effort that's rewarded. There can be emotional and social skill that's rewarded. Hey, our team lost, but there was great communication out there. No one got upset with each other. Everyone communicated very well. There was high effort. Again, there are things that, even if they're not outcome based, they can still be pleasantly rewarded and should be rewarded for. So when we think about feedback, we have different, depending on what text you look at, depending on what resource you're looking. But our text breaks down feedback into motivational feedback and instructional feedback. Motivational feedback: enhancing confidence, inspiring greater effort, creating a positive mood, right? Helping someone motivate to improve themselves, to put forth a better effort than they are already putting in. Instructional feedback: looking for specific things and behavior that they can change by helping, with either technical things or movement things, different things that they can change to better improve their performance. And of course, you can see how many times motivational and instructional feedback go hand in hand. For instance, think about a kicking drill in football. Let's say you're working with a kicker and they run up to kick a field goal and they miss the field goal. So, as part of instructional feedback, maybe a coach can say, what I noticed is your plant foot was way too far from the ball when your swing leg kicked it. So then you say, hey, go back and try to get your plant foot a little bit closer. And then they go in and they do it again with your cue. And this time they have their plant foot much closer to the football. They still missed the field goal, but based on instructional feedback, you can now tell them, hey, great job. You're getting better. You're being better at being more consistent with having that plant foot be next to the football. So keep it up. And we're going to work on making that field goal. So again, that's an example of how instruction feedback and motivational feedback work alongside one another. And again, these are on this page benefits of using these two types of feedback. Performance feedback, again, this ties into instruction feedback. Of course, provide feedback, knowledge of results, knowledge of performance, sincere, contingent feedback. You don't want to give athletes feedback on their performance that you don't think it's honest or true. It should be motivational, should be instructional. There can be varied types of feedback. It doesn't always have to be a coach saying something. It could be a facial expression, it could be a smile, it could be more of a touch of a thumbs up, a pat on the back, something that's appropriate. But of course, an intermingling of those types of feedback that can be important. So on the opposite side, what are things not to do when we look at feedback? Don't focus on criticism. Don't focus on criticism with sarcasm. Physical abuse, that's a big no. Guilt, that's a big no as well. I'm sure a lot of you have heard or seen stories where you have coaches throwing clipboards, throwing chairs, some really bad stories where coaches are actually physically abusive, when they punch, they push, they shove their players. That's not the way to go. And you do have these coaches that say things like, oh, if they complain about that kind of stuff, they're not tough, or this is the way things were always done. Well, it's true that some coaches were like that, or I'm sure some coaches are still like that now, and there's a level of success. But remember the bigger goal of what we are trying to do here: improve performance. So just because something is working for them, and maybe they're doing some of these things that they should not be doing, and they're having a high level of success, that doesn't mean they can't improve. And that doesn't mean that they shouldn't try to improve. And what's one way they can improve? Improve their own level of feedback by not doing these things and having more appropriate actions. So again, that's an important thing to consider. Now, punishment. Um, so punishment, and I said there's a small room for uh, I'd say negative punish. I know I said punishment before, but what I really meant by that comment earlier was negative punishment. Doing things like making people run laps, having people do push-ups, having people, move equipment, those kind of things. I'm sure those are all things that you've seen or experienced. There's room for that, but ultimately it should take up less than 10-15% of the reinforcement approach of a coach. So, of course, with punishment, particularly when we start looking at negative punishment, um, there's people that support it, there's people that criticize it, rightfully so. Those that support punishment, obviously, when it's done in that small 10 to 15% window and not overly done, claim that punishment can serve as an educational purpose, maintain stability, order, mastery. Of course, you have to be careful when you do this. And this coincides when you hear things such as coaches making examples of their athletes at practice. It's very easy for those things to become very hateful in nature. So that, again, any coach that uses any level of punishment has to have a clear rationale, has to be fair across the board, has to be deliberate, and cannot be excessive, cannot be cruel. Supporters also say things like punishment can deter future cheating or wrongdoing. Um, and it can't be all the time. I think that's a really important thing to note. It can't be every single practice. If a player doesn't do this, they have to run. They have to run over and over again. It happens every single practice. Once a week, not too bad. But if it happens every single practice, and the same players are not are the ones always receiving the punishment, then the question becomes, what are the expectations of the coach for the team, and are they not matching the actual ability of the skill? And if they're not matching the ability of the skill that the team has, then it's up to the coach to work on those skills and to adjust potential punishments accordingly. You can't give punishments out or show players the risk of punishment when you know that they're always going to fail at a task or be punished. That's intentional. It's not fair. Criticisms of punishment, kind of going along the lines of what I was just saying earlier. Punishment can be seen as degrading, shame producing, arouse fear of failure, can act as a reinforcer, and not always in a good way, and can create unpleasant learning environment. And again, if you cannot control the environment as the coach, and it becomes an environment of fear, dishonesty, or again, competition, again, competition in terms of to avoid punishment, and the competition starts to overshadow cooperation, then you start having different issues. Ultimately, the goal for an athlete, I think, as they, go through stages of life, and, potentially as they go through different levels of competition as they get older, is to reach a point where they're intrinsically motivated. Intrinsically motivated because they enjoy the activity that they like. They like competition, a healthy level of competition. They don't become upset to the point where they shut out cooperation. They have fun. They want to improve their skills. They want to be the best because they genuinely want to be the best. And they're more motivated with about those things as opposed to externally motivated things such as praise from others, money, so on and so forth. Those are the athletes that typically are the most successful. And I think that's where we see the best success. When I think of intrinsic motivation, I always think about exercise and how when individuals who don't exercise, or even obviously we're taking a step back from working with athletes, but individuals who don't exercise, when they want to start exercising, obviously they go through different stages of thought when it comes to deciding to exercise. Maybe they want to exercise because they want to get healthier, they want to lose weight, they want to be around for their children, their grandchildren, et cetera, et cetera. Over time, at the end of that process, those who stick to exercise the best, those are the ones who are intrinsically motivated to exercise. And the moment that switch happens from, at least talking about those individuals who start exercising, which happens from exercise is a task, it's a labor, it's a chore, it's something that they have to do. That switch, when that switch goes into they really enjoy it and they look forward to it, and they want to improve their skills and be the best versions of themselves they can be, and they genuinely embrace that, that's when you start to see adherence. Remember, adherence is how well someone sticks to something over a period of time. So they start exercising, they make a life habit out of exercising, at least routinely. With athletics, same thing here. If you have a kid who doesn't like soccer and they're playing soccer just because of their parents, they're never going to get to the level of intrinsic motivation in soccer because they don't like soccer. Or you get an athlete who is motivated just for financial purposes, and they want to make it to the professional level. And don't get me wrong, financial resources is a um, huge welcoming factor of professional sports, but they may not ever be as successful as those athletes who, aside from the financial wealth that they accumulate, they're also trying to improve their craft and be the best version of themselves that they can be. That is intrinsic motivation. And I really like this figure from the text. It puts intrinsic and extrinsic motivation on a continuum. A motivation is just someone who is not motivated to do anything. Where again, extrinsic motivation, motivation that comes from other things, other people, things that people are saying to you, giving you things you can earn. That's causing you to be motivated versus intrinsic motivation because you yourself want to improve, want to be the best you can. Um, that's when you start to see high self adherence, high self determination to your sport, to your task, to the goal at hand. And something that I pointed out on the last slide when I brought up the example of exercise is if we look here at what's known as the threshold of autonomy, that is where the person switches, that switch takes place, where the activity is something that they enjoy genuinely because they enjoy it, and they're not just doing it for other reasons. They start doing it for themselves. And notice it's really important to point here that when that switch happens, there's still some level of extrinsic motivation. So, what does that mean? That means that someone can genuinely enjoy the sport, want to improve their skills, but also genuinely enjoy maybe making money from the sport. Also enjoy getting praise, getting recognized by others, as doing a good job or being really good in their sport. Both of those things can be true in an individual. There's nothing wrong with that. But as we go up the continuum here, and I just lost my spot here, but as we go up the continuum here, we do start to see that as an athlete goes away from those material possessions or extrinsic possessions, extrinsic sources of motivation, they do become better self-functioning determinant athletes, right? More invested into their own process, not necessarily caring about the other things. And it's uh, you know, and someone that only cares about those things, that's rare. Because the social environment that someone grows up in, that's going to affect this. And there's nothing wrong with that. Think of how many professional athletes you talk to or you hear being interviewed or you hear them talk about. They don't have a lot of money growing up, so for many of them, sometimes the extrinsic motivation factor of making money goes into their intrinsic motivation. So both, come together to help fuel the motivation. Nothing wrong with that, but again, as they make money, as they help their families, perhaps they get more into the side of, here I'm going to master my craft as an athlete. So let me just clear this out. And that's how we see both sides of the coin when it comes to a motivation, intrinsic motivation, and how as someone goes through intrinsic motivation, they pass the threshold there of autonomy. Okay, so we're almost done here. A couple of things I just want to point out here at the end. So some factors that influence intrinsic motivation. I've mentioned some of these already. Societal factors, success, failure, focus of competition, coach's behavior, psychological factors, need for competence, autonomy, relatedness, passion. Um, Something that I do want to point out. So there's great information in your text as it relates to passion. So make sure that as you read this chapter, and again, this content on this side of the presentation is coming from chapter 7, you focus a little bit of your time more on passion and also on different other things that are related to passion. But what I do want to point out is our text breaks down passion into two types of passion: harmonious passion, a strong desire to engage in an activity freely as it becomes part of one identity; and obsessive passion, a controllable desire to participate in activity that does not become part of one's identity. So when we talk about harmonious passion, that is flow. And the concept of flow is rather lengthy. The text goes into it a pretty long um soliloquy or pretty long details about flow. And I didn't attach to the presentation. I didn't want to go too long, but I do want you, just like I encourage you to spend some time with passion, I want you to spend some time looking into flow. And flow, essentially, as you can imagine, at least it pertains to activity, someone performing an activity, someone's ability to engage in the sport and not be overly excited, not be overly worked, overly anxious, um, to the point where it starts decreasing performance, and they have just the right level of arousal to perform within their sport. It becomes an easier task for them to do. So when we look at the concept of flow, more associated with harmonious passion versus obsessive passion, again, someone's doing something because they uh, they feel like they need to do it, perhaps for extrinsic factors, right? They need to make money, they need to make the team, they need to do this, they need to do that, as opposed to they just enjoy it and it is who they are. And again, both of these things can occur at the same time. Passion doesn't have to be one or the other. There can be different levels of harmonious passion, obsessive passion in someone's overall passion for a sport. So the last part here of this module is really interesting, I think. So we know that the goal ultimately is to reach intrinsic motivation. We know that intrinsic motivation and some levels of extrinsic motivation can still happen at the same time. So is it possible to use extrinsic rewards to keep intrinsic motivation? Well, what the research shows us is that not really. So what does that mean? That means that the more extrinsic rewards you attach to something where someone is already intrinsically motivated, you can actually start to decrease their intrinsic motivation for the activity. What's the most common example? Money. It's very easy in professional sports for someone who is successful early on in their career, intrinsically motivated, as they start making millions and millions and millions of dollars, it's very easy for that person to start losing sight of their love for the sport. And in turn, they become less intrinsically motivated. And then what happens? Then you start to see rookies in the sport who excel because they haven't made their money yet. So they maybe are more intrinsically motivated. Of course, there are always exceptions of those elite athletes who continue to be intrinsically motivated despite their extrinsic rewards, but it doesn't always play out that way. That's why, and we're going to talk about this throughout the semester, but you think about college sports, that's why so many people, and obviously there's a debate whether or not college athletes uh, should get paid, and perhaps that's a debate for another course. But as it stands right now, many people love college sports more than professional sports for that reason, because they feel that the college athletes are more intrinsically motivated when they compete compared to professional sports. Now, again, that's a debate all of it in itself as well, and that some parts of that can be true and other parts not so true. But that money, and it doesn't have to be money, but money is probably the easy example to think of when we think about an intrinsic reward. Um, Probably another good example, and I kind of mentioned this earlier as well, doing things for someone else, right? Doing an activity, doing a sport for a parent, for a coach, instead of doing it for yourself, or doing it for your friends as well, right? Maybe all your other friends are doing it, so you're doing it as well. Many high schools that I've worked at, I've seen this come up in track and field. I can't tell you how many times I've seen it come up in track and field, where you have kids that hate running, hate track and field events, that they're on these teams, and then you ask them why they're doing it, and they say, "Oh, well, all my other friends were doing it." Obviously, you can't expect that individual to be intrinsically motivated. Their extrinsic reward is being involved in a group with their friends. So again, that's another example, maybe not at the professional level, that we can see take place on a pretty often basis. Let's look at some other extrinsic rewards. So scholarship can go either way, increase, decrease, right? Someone can be more intrinsically motivated if they don't have a scholarship and they want to get a scholarship, or they get a scholarship and they want to keep the scholarship. Someone can be decreased perhaps if they know that they have a scholarship and they know that their scholarship will guarantee them a spot on a team, depending on the circumstance. So maybe they lose some intrinsic motivations. I can go back and forth. And again, that effect could be determined by not only the behavior of the coach, but also, of course, on the situational environment. Success, failure. When someone is very successful, it's easier for them to continue to work on their craft because they want to continue to uphold that level of success. Sometimes failure causes someone to lose a little bit of the love in the sport, a little bit of that intrinsic motivation, right? Particularly when they try year and year again and they don't improve, or they keep failing at a particular task. That could be discouraging. And that level of discouragement not only brings down, but also starts taking a hit of that intrinsic motivation. What do we have here again? Positive feedback increases intrinsic motivation. And we talked about the importance of positive feedback not too long ago. Couple last points here. Higher levels of intrinsic motivation are related to the following: playing for a coach who is less controlling, participating in activities for fun, right? Recreational, necessarily not always competitive. Again, there goes that balance of knowing when to have competition but not be overly competitive to the point where you lose out on cooperation. Having higher perceived competence, having higher perceived control. So the more someone feels that they are actually good at their sport, good at their activity, of course, they're going to be more intrinsically motivated. No one likes to do things that they're not good at. I think that goes without saying. High level of control. If someone feels as if they're very good at something and they feel as if they have a good control to get better, high level of intrinsic motivation. But if someone's very bad at something and they don't feel like they can do anything to improve, very low level of intrinsic motivation. Autonomy, supportive versus controlling coaching. You don't always need your coach there to tell you everything what to do. If you can make decisions on your own, if you feel confident in your technique, you're more autonomous in your performance, more intrinsic motivation comes with that. And then the last part of this is being careful, because we saw obviously some detriments of external rewards, and we don't want to decrease intrinsic motivation. We want our athletes to have high intrinsic motivation. So here are some tips for external rewards. It doesn't always have to be money. Sometimes the rewards can be creative, simple, new, novel. That's what that means. Novel means new. They should be given to help athletes improve, not control them. Right? Athletes should not be obsessive over external rewards. They should help, or they can help individuals that are not motivated to participate, and they should be contingent on behavior, and they shouldn't be given all the time. Right? They should be used sparingly, not all the time. And then I want to end here in this figure where we have this figure here. This model comes from Kimesic and Stein, where you see they have four quadrants: anxiety, flow, apathy, boredom. And we spent some time talking about anxiety. I mentioned flow, and I want you to spend more time with the concept of flow in your text. But we also have apathy, someone not caring at all, and boredom, someone being bored of an activity. Uh, Depending on the skills, depending on how the high the challenge is, that's going to affect their performance. So if you look at, let's consider if someone is bored but in a level of flow, that means that perhaps they're able to be bored with a high level of flow because their skills are that high. Right? It's too easy for them. Versus someone that maybe has low level of skills, but even if the challenge is low, relatively easy, again, it's easy for them, but they're also not very that good at it, so they just don't care. As opposed to someone being bored who has high level of skills. Now, on the flip side, if someone is uh, the challenge is very high and the skills are high, they're more likely to be put in that flow environment. But if the challenge is high and the skills are low, they're more likely to be very anxious. And of course, with flow, you know, when there's some level of anxiety within the flow, and that's your text refers to that as a clutch state, that's not a bad thing either. Remember, some level of anxiety is not a bad thing in performance as long as it doesn't become overwhelming, completely disrupts flow, and again starts having all the negative consequences that we've talked about. So that wraps things up for module 5. Hopefully now not only can you define competition, cooperation, feedback, reinforcement, and intrinsic motivation, but you can also understand how competition and cooperation are both important. Competition is important, but it's important not to have too much of a competitive state that it starts interfering with cooperative teamwork. And also understand that punishment, particularly negative punishment, should only hold a very small percentage of the reinforcement that takes place in order to help athletes achieve intrinsic motivation. Because at the end of the day, the more intrinsically motivated our athletes are, the better they will perform. And of course, we understand that intrinsic motivation is important as well, and that it's not uncommon to have athletes that are both extrinsic and intrinsic motivated. In fact, that's the most common situation that athletes find themselves in. But what is important when we look at extrinsic motivation is when that switch happens, right? That threshold of autonomy, which starts making athletes feel as if they're doing things for themselves as opposed to other people and other things. So we'll leave things there and we'll pick it up with the next module.